The planet Quarum was in its final throes. Once a vibrant world teeming with life, it had been a beacon of hope amidst the coldness of space. Now, it lay in ruins, a mere graveyard. Its surface was cracked and scorched from the endless war between humans and the alien race known as the Priel Rat. Heron, a former soldier turned explorer, could feel the planet's despair with every step he took. The ground beneath him was fragile and brittle, the air heavy with the metallic stench of decay and destruction. The sky above was a muted orange, scarred by the remnants of firestorms and distant energy bursts from ongoing battles. The war, like a voracious parasite, had drained this world of everything it once had to offer. Heron had seen death before, too much of it. As a soldier, he had been at the heart of the conflict for years, and the brutality of the endless fighting had transformed him. He had left the army because he could no longer bear the bloodshed and the senseless cycle of hatred. He had accepted this mission, to recover critical data from a remote human outpost, believing it would be a simple task, far from the front lines and chaos. But even here, in the desolate wasteland, the echoes of war were palpable. As he navigated through the rubble of what was once a Criddle Rat settlement, something caught his eye. At first, it was subtle. A flash of vibrant color among the gray and brown debris. Instinctively, Heron approached, his hand hovering near his weapon. But as he neared the source, he halted. His breath caught in his throat. Half buried in the wreckage was an alien woman. Unmistakably a Karen approach, rat, but not like the enemies he had faced in battle. Her deep purple skin glimmered faintly in the dim light of dusk. Her tall, graceful figure lay crumpled, limbs splayed unnaturally, as if she had fallen without the strength to rise. She was visibly pregnant, her abdomen swollen with the weight of her unborn children, and her beautiful, alien face twisted in a grimace of pain. She was dying. Heron's military training urged him to move on, to leave her be. She was a Kell rat, a member of the species that had slaughtered his people, destroyed entire colonies, and brought humanity to the brink of extinction. But as he stood there, looking at her, something within him shifted. It was as if the war that had hardened his heart began to crack, just a little. She was not a soldier. Not in that moment. She was a vulnerable mother desperate for help, and in that instant, the line between enemy and ally blurred. Heron took a cautious step forward, his breath quickening. The woman's eyes were closed. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, and beneath her, he could see a dark stain of blood seeping from a wound in her side, mingling with the dust and debris. Heron's heart raced as he knelt beside her, inspecting her injuries. They were grave, far worse than he had anticipated. She would not survive long without medical attention. Why was he doing this? Why couldn't he just move on? Questions gnawed at him as he pulled a bandage from his pack, his hands moving automatically. He could hear his commanding officer's voice in his head, the lessons drilled into him during the war. The Kell Rat are dangerous, Heron. But this was no battlefield, and he was no longer a soldier. Something about this woman, the way her body trembled in pain, the life growing within her, compelled him to act. There was another reason, however, buried deep within his past, a memory he seldom let surface. It was years ago, during his first rescue mission. His unit had been sent to evacuate civilians from a besieged colony. They arrived too late. Bodies littered the streets. Men, women, children. All dead because his unit had not been fast enough. No, Heron could not let that happen again. Not here. Not now. He worked quickly, bandaging the wound in her side, pressing the gauze against the laceration to staunch the bleeding. As he did, the woman's eyelids fluttered, and he froze, wondering if she would defend herself, if her survival instinct would see him as a threat. But her iridescent silver eyes, so unlike anything human, opened and locked onto his. In that moment, something passed between them. No words, just emotions, a plea. She was begging for help, not with her voice, but with her presence. The Cell Rat had telepathic abilities, though hers seemed weak, worn down by fatigue and pain. Heron could feel her thoughts barely brushing against his mind, too scattered to form coherent messages. But the raw emotions came through clearly: fear, desperation, protection. Her mind was not focused on herself, but on the life growing within her, on the unborn children who would not survive if she did not. "I'm here," murmured Heron, unsure if she would understand. "I'm going to help you." She did not respond with words, but her gaze softened, her breathing still shallow, yet slightly more regular. He was uncertain if it was his presence or her own resilience that had made the difference. But for the first time in a long while, Heron felt he was doing something that mattered. Night fell quickly over Quarum, and the temperature plummeted, a brutal contrast to the sweltering heat of the day. Heron had managed to stabilize the Carol Rat woman's injury, but he knew the bandage was merely a temporary fix. The cold was beginning to seep through his explorer suit, and the figure lying before him trembled, her purple skin losing its luster under the light of the twin moons. There was no time to waste. He looked around for some shelter. Not far off, the remnants of an ancient structure jutted out from the shadows. It appeared to be a military outpost, long abandoned, but its walls still stood. It was their only option. Carefully, he bent to lift the woman, noting how light she felt in his arms, as if her body could no longer bear the weight of the life she carried. She let out a faint whimper of pain, but offered no resistance, too weak to do so. They moved slowly through the ruins toward the building. The debris crunched underfoot. The sounds of war, distant yet present, echoed in the air. Heron knew they were not safe. Human patrols and cell rat squads were constantly moving through the area. If they were found, the situation would be fatal for both of them. No one would forgive him for aiding an enemy, let alone a pregnant woman. Upon reaching the building, Heron slipped through an opening in the crumbling wall and found a small nook sheltered from the wind. Gently, he laid the woman on the ground and covered her with a thermal blanket from his gear. She shivered, her breathing irregular, but she seemed a bit calmer. Heron sat beside her, watching the horizon, rifle in hand, as the sounds of war faded into the distance. Time passed in silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the occasional moans of the woman. Heron watched her, wondering who she was and how she had ended up in this situation. She seemed so vulnerable. As he lost himself in thought, he felt a gentle touch in his mind. It was a barely perceptible brush, but clear enough for him to know she was trying to communicate. He closed his eyes, focusing on that faint connection. The emotions he sensed were a whirlwind of fear, pain, and above all, a desire to protect. She was not worried about herself, but about the being she carried in her womb. "I'm here," he whispered, knowing she might not understand his words but hoping his tone would soothe her. "I'll get you out of here." The silver eyes of the woman opened slowly, focusing on him. For a moment their gazes locked, and Heron felt a pulse of something more. Beyond simple understanding, it was as if she was trying to convey a message, but her strength was not enough to form words in his mind. Still, Heron understood. They did not need a shared language to know they were both trapped on a dying planet, amidst a war that offered no hope. Determined, he stood and began preparing the space for the night. He gathered some pieces of metal and plastic he found in the outpost to build an improvised barrier against the cold wind. Then he ignited a small emergency heater and sat back down beside her, offering her the warmth of his body. "Heron," he said, pointing to his chest, hoping she would understand his name. She blinked, her eyes shining with curiosity. Then, with visible effort, she pointed to her own chest. "Yara," she whispered weakly. Heron felt a strange sense of relief. Now she had a name, something that humanized her situation further. With each passing moment, the war, the orders, and everything he had learned about the kill rat seemed to fade away, replaced by an urgent need to protect her. The night wore on, and Yara fell into a restless sleep. Heron stayed awake, his mind racing with plans. They could not remain in this refuge for long. The place was too exposed, and if patrols found them, it would be impossible to explain why a former human soldier was helping a pregnant Kel Rat woman. As he watched her sleep, he noticed her breathing becoming more irregular, her face twisting in a grimace of pain. Something was wrong. He checked the bandage on her side and saw that the wound was still bleeding and her fever was rising. He didn't have many options, but he had to act quickly. He decided to search for some kind of medication or medical equipment in the outpost. Hopefully, something would have survived the abandonment of the place. He walked through the dimly lit hallways, feeling the chill of the metal structure beneath his feet. The place was in ruins, but after a few minutes of searching, he found what he was looking for. A military first aid kit, somewhat old but complete. He returned to where Yara lay and began administering the medication. She stirred, moaning in her sleep. But slowly her breathing began to calm, and her skin regained some of its original color. Heron allowed himself a small sigh of relief as he adjusted the blankets over her. He felt that telepathic connection again, this time stronger. Yara's emotions flowed toward him with clarity. Fear, hope, and surprisingly, gratitude. He didn't know how, but she understood that he was there to help her, that he was not like the soldiers she had faced before. "I will protect you," he said, aware that she might not understand, but feeling it was important to say. Yara opened her eyes slightly and, with a gentle movement, took Heron's hand. Her touch was soft, but the connection he felt through it was intense. The wind battered the structure, and the echoes of war faded into the distance. Heron knew the coming hours would be crucial. If they wanted to survive, they had to move soon. But as he searched alongside her for warmth and comfort, he felt that for the first time in a long while, he had a purpose. The war still raged on the horizon, but in this small corner of a ruined world, Heron had found something more important than the mission he had come to fulfill. The life Yara carried within her, and he would do whatever it took to protect it. Dawn brought with it a pale light that barely penetrated the clouds covering the sky of Quorum. The warmth of the previous day was replaced by a biting cold that seeped through the cracks of their makeshift shelter. Heron jolted awake as he felt a slight tremor in Yara's body, still resting beside him. His hands shook as he searched for signs of improvement in her condition, but the fever persisted, and her breaths remained shallow. He knew they could not stay there much longer. The medication he had administered the night before had only temporarily stabilized her condition. If they did not find help soon, Yara and the children she carried would be in danger. "Yara, we have to move," he said softly, trying to wake her without frightening her. Her silver eyes opened slowly, and a shadow of recognition crossed her face. She looked exhausted but nodded, understanding they needed to leave. "Can you walk?" Heron asked as he helped her sit up. Yara clung to his arm, her legs trembling at first, but she eventually managed to stand. Heron felt a wave of relief. At least they had a chance. Together, they stepped out of the refuge, their bodies hunched low as they slipped through the ruins. The air was thick with palpable tension, and Heron knew that at any moment they could encounter a human patrol or Excel rat squad. As they moved, his mind focused on one goal: an old military bunker located a few kilometers south of the outpost. If they could reach it, they might find medical supplies and safe shelter, at least temporarily. The problem was that the path was not only long, but also dangerous. And with Yara in her current state, any hostile encounter could mean the end for both of them. Progress was slow. The debris and ruins made each step a risk, and Heron paused every few meters to ensure the path was clear. On more than one occasion, he spotted shadows in the distance, signs that patrols were moving nearby, but they managed to avoid being seen. As they neared the edge of a wooded area, something caught Heron's attention: a metallic glint reflected in the distance among the dead trees. He signaled for Yara to stop and crouched down, observing closely. It was a basic human reconnaissance drone, effective enough to alert nearby forces if it detected movement. Great, he thought. The most direct route to the bunker was blocked. "There's another way, but it will be longer," Heron murmured, looking at Yara, who followed his gaze with tired yet attentive eyes. She nodded, showing she understood. Heron felt a pang of admiration for her resilience. He knew every step cost her immense effort, but there were no complaints in her eyes. Only determination. They decided to skirt around the drone's area, moving through uneven terrain covered with mutated plants due to the radiation and chemical attacks of the war. As they made their way through the foliage, he felt the gentle brush in his mind again, signaling that Yara was trying to communicate. This time, the connection was clearer. "Heron, why are you helping me?" The question formed in his mind with a sense of pain and curiosity. Heron paused, surprised by the clarity of her words. He looked at Yara, who regarded him with a mixture of gratitude and doubt in her silver eyes. "I don't know if I have a simple answer," he admitted, taken aback by his own honesty. "I've spent too long fighting in this war, and have seen the worst of both sides. But when I found you, I couldn't just leave you." He paused, searching for the right words. You are not an enemy. Right now, you are someone who needs help, and I couldn't just walk away. Yara looked at him in silence for a moment, and Heron felt the echo of her thoughts in his mind. It was as if she was trying to understand his reasoning, to process that a human, her enemy, was risking his life for her. Finally, Yara smiled faintly. A small gesture, but one that revealed so much. Thank you, Heron. The warmth of her words flowed through the telepathic connection, and Heron felt a comforting warmth in his chest. Perhaps for the first time in years, he felt he was doing something that truly mattered. Something that transcended the war. They resumed their march, slowly approaching the bunker. As they progressed, the terrain grew more rugged, and Yara, increasingly weakened, began to stumble. Heron held her up, worried by the pallor of her face. He knew exhaustion was catching up with her, and with her fever still high, he couldn't risk pushing her further. He decided to find a safe place where they could stop, at least until she regained some strength. They found a concealed spot behind some dry bushes, deep enough to offer temporary refuge. Heron helped Yara sit down and covered her with his thermal jacket, ensuring she was as comfortable as possible. He stayed by her side, watching the entrance and listening to the sounds of the barren jungle around them. Rest a bit, he said, closing his eyes as his mind filled with thoughts. Alive. While Yara breathed, he thanked fate for bringing them together. And as he kept his mind alert, the silence was broken by a sound that Heron recognized immediately. The hum of a vehicle engine. Patrols, he thought. And they were not human. Through the distance, he could see the silhouettes of shell rat soldiers advancing. His breath quickened, and his mind raced, searching for an escape. We have to go, he whispered, shaking Yara to wake her. Her eyes opened wide, and with effort she nodded. But before they could move, the Kara rat patrols were already too close. He glanced around desperately, and only found the options to fight or attempt to reason with them. With a wave of his hand, he signaled to Yara to stay hidden while he moved toward the entrance of the cave, raising his weapon cautiously. If there was any chance of getting out of this situation, he would have to risk it all. The footsteps of the Karen rat soldiers drew near, and Heron felt his pulse quicken. He knew that at any moment, everything could end, but as he prepared to confront them, he felt something in his mind, a stronger telepathic push, a plea from Yara. Don't attack them. Let me try. Heron hesitated but lowered his weapon slightly. Yara, with great effort, stepped out of the cave, leaning against the wall to stay upright. She extended her hand toward the approaching soldiers, and Heron felt her telepathic power expand, uniting her thoughts with those of her species. The communication was clear, their emotions flowing like a torrent. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The soldiers halted, their weapons raised but not firing. Their faces were confused as they felt the telepathic connection. Heron held his breath, hoping Yara's plea would be enough to convince them that they were not a threat. The Xel rat soldiers stopped a few meters from Heron and Yara, their weapons raised, but with a hesitation they had not shown before. Heron could feel the tension in the air, a heavy silence laden with possibilities and danger. The soldiers' eyes, a bright green, focused on Yara, who, despite her evident weakness, stood tall with a determination in her silver eyes that seemed to defy any threat. Heron gritted his teeth, keeping his weapon lowered but ready, prepared for any eventuality. He felt Yara's telepathic connection extending toward the soldiers, like a fragile bridge trying to unite two sides divided by war. The energy in the air was palpable, as if a deep conversation was taking place among them. They are my brothers, Yara said in a whisper, barely audible to Heron, her thoughts forming a faint echo in his mind. They are confused. Heron nodded slightly, keeping his eyes on the soldiers. He knew that if Yara did not manage to convince them that they were not a threat, things would turn violent quickly. The Karadrat were not known for their compassion, especially toward those associated with humans. One of the soldiers stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with distrust as he fixed his gaze on Heron. He raised his weapon slightly, aiming it between Heron and his companions. "Barris, please," Yara said, her voice trembling. Heron felt a wave of desperation in her tone. "It's not what you think." The soldier Yara had called Barricus frowned, his features tense as he looked at her. The telepathic connection between them strengthened, and Heron could sense a wave of emotions that did not belong to him. Confusion, betrayal, and disbelief. Barrios's thoughts were a whirlwind that Yara was trying to calm. "Why are you with a human?" Barkalanis asked, his voice rough and laden with suspicion. "They are enemies. Yara, they have killed us, destroyed our colonies. Why are you on their side?" Quote. Yara lowered her gaze for a moment, but then lifted her head with a resolute expression. Heron felt a kind of strength in her thoughts, as if everything that had happened since he found her had somehow fortified her. "He saved me, Baris. I was hurt, alone, and he protected me," she explained, her words so sincere that even Heron felt their weight. "If it weren't for him, I and my children—" Yara paused, her hand instinctively resting on her swollen belly. "We wouldn't be alive." Quote, "The soldiers murmured among themselves, their weapons still raised, but doubt reflected in their faces." Heron felt the urge to speak, to explain his side of the story, but he knew that at that moment his presence was a hindrance, not a help. Accelrat would only see him as a threat. "Please," Yara continued, her voice a whisper heavy with emotion, "don't do this to me, don't do this to us. This human has risked everything to save me, and though it may seem impossible, I trust him." Silence stretched, broken only by the rustling of dry leaves and the cold wind that swept through the cave's entrance. The soldiers exchanged glances, confusion evident on their faces. Heron could feel the tension in the air, as if with each passing second, the fragile thread of peace grew tighter. Finally, Baron Kutasis lowered his weapon, and with him, the other two soldiers did the same. Baron Kutasis' gaze softened, but there was still distrust in his eyes. "If you're telling the truth, Yara, then we will protect you," Barrios said, his voice gentler. "But if we find out that this human is a threat—" "He is not," Yara interrupted firmly. "We need to reach a safe place where we can get help." She hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the reality she faced. "I don't know if I can hold on much longer in these conditions." Barrios looked at his companions and nodded. "There's a bunker a few kilometers north," he said. "It's an abandoned medical facility of our people. Perhaps there we can find what you need." Quote, Yara nodded, and Heron felt an immediate sense of relief, though concern still lingered. He knew that trusting the Killrat soldiers was a risk, but they had no other options. Yara's health was deteriorating, and if there was a chance to save her, they had to take it. The group moved forward, the Carol Rat leading the way. Heron and Yara stayed in the center of the formation, their steps synchronized as they followed the route to the bunker. Heron could feel the furtive glances of the soldiers upon him, but he kept calm, knowing that any hostile gesture on his part would ruin the fragile truce Yara had managed to establish. The walk was exhausting, especially for Yara, who struggled with each step. Heron supported her by the arm, trying to ease her burden. He felt the fever burning beneath her skin, and his worry grew. Time was running against them. Upon reaching the bunker, a metallic structure partially hidden under a mantle of mutated vegetation, the Kennel Rat soldiers checked the entrance, ensuring it was clear before allowing them to pass. The interior was dark, but the air was warmer, and the feeling of being sheltered, at least for a moment, gave them a breath of relief. Baratius turned on a portable light that illuminated the main room of the bunker. Yara collapsed onto one of the stretchers, her strength spent. Heron helped her lie down and began searching through the supplies, finding a medical kit containing pain relievers and antibiotics. "This should help," he said as he prepared an injection and carefully administered it. The soldiers watched in silence, and Heron could feel the distrust in their eyes. He knew they were still soldiers in wartime, and one mistake could end everything. But for now, they had a common goal: to keep Yara and her children alive. As the medication began to take effect, Yara sighed, her muscles relaxing somewhat. Heron sat beside her, letting his thoughts settle. Although the tension still throbbed in the back of his mind, Baris approached, his eyes fixed on Heron. "I don't know what kind of agreement you two have, but my loyalty lies with my people," he warned. "If I ever see you as a risk to her or to us, I will not hesitate to act." Heron met his gaze firmly. "I understand, and I wouldn't blame you for protecting your people, but I give you my word, I am not here to fight. I am here to help Yara." The Barris looked at him in silence for a moment before nodding. "I hope you keep your word, human." Heron nodded, and at that moment he felt that, at least for an instant, they had reached an understanding. War had placed them on opposing sides, but fate had united them for something much more important: With the silence in the bunker heavy, Yara, now resting, smiled weakly at Heron. "We're one step closer," she said, her thoughts flowing through the telepathic connection. "Thank you, Heron." He returned her smile, feeling that though the future was uncertain, he was not alone in this battle. As he prepared for what was to come, he knew his mission had changed forever. It was no longer just about survival. It was about protecting what he had found in Yara and the children she carried. A spark of hope in a world ravaged by hatred and war. The bunker was a haven of calm amid the chaos surrounding the outside world. But Heron knew that tranquility would not last long. The Kale Rat soldiers remained silent, their eyes. As he rested, he rose and walked toward Barcaeus, who was near the entrance, monitoring any activity outside. The dim light of the bunker illuminated the hard features he still bore. "How long can we stay here before we're discovered?" Heron asked, his tone calm but laden with concern. Baricus regarded him for a moment before responding. "Not long. Human and Kel Rat patrols roam this area. This bunker has been out of service for months, but if anyone detects signs of life, they will come to investigate." Heron nodded, knowing he was right. Though they had found a respite, they remained in dangerous territory. "We need more time. Yara is not ready to move yet." Barris frowned but said nothing. Instead, he turned to one of the other soldiers who was checking the supplies, looking for something useful. Meanwhile, Heron returned to Yara, whose breathing had slightly improved thanks to the medication he had given her. "How do you feel?" he asked, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Better," she replied, her voice barely a whisper but stronger than before. Her gaze searched for Heron's, and he felt the telepathic connection reaffirming itself. "But we're not safe here, are we?" Heron shook his head. "Not for long. But we will find a way to get you out of here." He paused and, lowering his voice, added, "Yara, if this gets complicated, I want you to know that I will do whatever it takes to keep you safe." Yara smiled faintly, but her mind Heron felt a wave of concern mixed with gratitude. She knew he was willing to risk everything, and that strengthened her. But it also worried her. "I don't want you to put your life in danger for me." "Heron, I already did," she replied with a firmness that brooked no argument. As the two looked at each other, one of the Kelrat soldiers approached, breaking the moment. It was Talak, the youngest of the group, with a stern yet anxious face. "Baron Geddes wants to talk to you," he said to Heron. Heron nodded and stood, leaving Yara with a gesture of reassurance. He walked toward the entrance, where Baron Geddes awaited him. The soldier scrutinized him closely, his expression as serious as ever. "We've been analyzing escape routes," Baroness said. "There's a safe path, but it's risky. We'll have to cross an area controlled by human patrols to reach a point where a transport can pick us up. If we're discovered, there will be no escape." Heron considered the information, nodding slowly. "It's a risk we'll have to take, Yarak. Yara can't move on her own in this condition." Baritakas crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on Heron. "You need to understand something, human. If things get complicated, my priority will be my people and Yara. If that means sacrificing you to protect them, I will do it." Heron didn't flinch. "No. I understand, and I wouldn't blame you for doing so. But if we reach that point, I trust you will make the right decision." Baritakas held his gaze for a few more seconds before nodding. "I hope you can maintain that trust." Heron then turned to his soldiers. "No." Heron returned to Yara, who looked at him with curiosity. "What happened?" she asked, sensing the tension in his face. "We leave at dawn. Varus believes there's a safe route, but it's dangerous." Heron sighed, letting out the frustration he had been suppressing. "It's all a risk, Yara, but there's no other option." Yara extended a hand, gently touching Heron's arm, and he felt their telepathic connection stronger than ever. "I trust you. We will make it." Time passed slowly, and the tension in the bunker grew with each minute. Outside, the wind howled, and the distant sound of explosions and gunfire reminded everyone that war surrounded them. Without pause, while Yara tried to rest, Heron remained vigilant, his thoughts in constant conflict. He knew what they were about to do was dangerous, but he also knew he had no other choice. As dawn arrived, the group prepared to depart. Bars led the way, followed by Talak and the third soldier, Kieran, who checked every angle and shadow as they moved. Heron helped Yara walk, her steps slow but steady. He could feel the pressure of the situation on his shoulders, but he knew he couldn't afford to waver. They followed the path Barius had charted, moving silently through the shadows of the ruins of Quararum. The sun barely rose on the horizon, casting everything in a muted orange hue. Each step brought them closer to the extraction point, but also increased the risk of detection. Suddenly, Talak raised his hand, signaling something in the distance. Heron crouched, observing closely. A human convoy was approaching, its vehicles moving slowly across the terrain. Barcius gestured for everyone to stay still and silent. Heron gritted his teeth, knowing they were in a vulnerable position. The human soldiers would not give them a chance to explain themselves. If they were found, they would be considered enemies, regardless of the temporary truce he and the Xelrat had managed to establish. "We need to flank them," Baradus murmured, his eyes watching every movement of the vehicles. "Talak, Kirin, flank from the east side. Heron, keep Yara safe and follow us closely." Heron nodded, helping Yara move as they advanced along a side path, their bodies pressed to the ground to avoid detection. The air was thick with tension, and every crunch beneath their feet seemed to resonate like thunder in the silence. The human convoy passed slowly but did not stop as moved on, their presence a latent threat that faded as they distanced themselves. The group waited a few more moments before resuming their advance. With every step, Heron felt adrenaline coursing through his veins. But when they finally reached the extraction point, a momentary relief filled the air. It was a small landing base, hidden beneath foliage and designed for infiltration missions. The transport was on its way. However, the calm was fleeting. A shot rang out in the distance, and in an instant, chaos ensued. The human soldiers had detected their position, and Heron saw the shadows of their figures approaching rapidly. "Stay unseen," Talak shouted, firing toward the humans to cover their position. Barris and Kirin joined the fight, trying to hold back the advancing forces. Heron, heart pounding, positioned himself next to Yara, his weapon ready. He couldn't let anything happen to her. Yara's voice echoed in his mind. He nodded, determined. The transport was only minutes away, but they knew the fight would be intense. Heron and the Carolrat soldiers prepared for combat, and amid the crossfire, they clung to the hope that they could protect Yara and the children she carried. The battle had begun, and Heron knew everything was at stake. The sound of gunfire reverberated in the air, and Heron instinctively ducked, dragging Yara toward a safer position behind a wall of ruins. Bullets whizzed overhead, and the ground vibrated under the pressure of nearby explosions. Barius and the other Kailrat soldiers responded to the human fire, maintaining the defensive line as the transport drew closer. "Hold on, Yara!" Heron shouted as he reloaded his rifle, scanning for any opportunity to move. "The transport is almost here!" Yara, her pale face glistening with sweat, nodded weakly. The fever that had weakened her in the past hours seemed to intensify with the stress of battle, and Heron knew every second counted. The telepathic connection between them remained, but its intensity fluctuated like a candle in the wind. The human soldiers advanced quickly, taking advantage of the terrain and firing with precision. Barithius turned to Heron, his expression grave. "We won't be able to hold this position for long. We need to fall back to the landing zone." Heron nodded, aware that time was running out. He looked at Yara, and she returned his gaze, filled with determination despite her evident weakness. "We can do this," Heron said, trying to encourage her. "Just be careful." He helped Yara to her feet, and together they began to move, crouching low as they navigated through the ruins. Barricenius and the other soldiers covered their retreat, firing accurately to keep the humans at bay. However, enemy fire intensified, and Heron knew it was only a matter of time before they were outnumbered. The sound of the transport engines grew louder, a buzzing that pierced the air and filled Heron with frantic hope. The transport appeared in the sky, descending rapidly toward the landing base, hidden among the vegetation. "There it is!" Kirin shouted, pointing to the approaching vehicle. "Let's go!" The group hurried, but the enemy was moving too. The human soldiers, seeing the transport, redoubled their efforts, opening fire with greater intensity. One of the shots struck near Heron and Yara, kicking up a cloud of dust and debris that sent them tumbling to the ground. "No!" Yara's telepathic voice was a cry of warning. Heron turned just in time to see a human soldier aiming at him from a distance. The soldier's finger tightened on the trigger, but at the last second, Talak intervened, taking down the attacker with a precise shot. "Come on, human!" Talak shouted, extending a hand to help them up. Heron took the hand of the Kariel rat soldier, and together they lifted Yara, resuming their advance toward the ship. The transport finally touched down, and the ramp deployed with a sharp thud. The pilot, a weathered Kariel rat, gestured for them to board. "Quick! Cover the retreat!" Baritakas ordered as Heron and Yara ran toward the ramp. Talak and Kieran fired continuously, holding back the advancing human forces. Heron climbed aboard first, helping Yara up the ramp as the crossfire intensified. Finally, Barharis and the other soldiers joined them, retreating and firing until they were all on board. The pilot wasted no time. The transport's engines roared to life, and the ship began to rise, pulling away from the combat zone. The gunfire continued, but the transport quickly gained altitude. From the window, Heron could see the remaining human soldiers behind them, their shots ineffective against the vehicle's armor. The tension that had kept him alert slowly faded, and for a moment, he could breathe a sigh of relief. But the relief was short-lived. Yara, who had held on until that moment with impressive strength, began to sway. Heron caught her as her legs gave way, and laid her down on one of the seats. "Yara, hold on," he said, his hands trembling as he checked her pulse. She was weak, and the fever was still rising. Baracus approached, concern etched on his face. "We can't lose her. We need to get her to a medical center as soon as possible." Heron nodded, but his mind was filled with uncertainty here. He knew the transport would take them to a Kentiel rat outpost, and while the temporary truce had allowed them to escape together, he wasn't sure how the Kentiel rat authorities would react to seeing a human accompanying Yara, especially in her vulnerable state. "Bershleys, what will happen when we reach the outpost?" Heron asked, a note of worry in his voice. Barius looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of distrust and pragmatism. "I don't know, Heron. It will all depend on the officers present, but if we can explain what you've done for her and the children she carries, maybe we can convince them you're not a threat." Yara opened her eyes slowly, and Heron felt a new telepathic connection, though weak. "I trust Heron. Whatever happens, we will face it together." Heron felt a surge of determination. He could not allow Yara and her children to suffer any longer. To Burris. He turned to Barras, his expression firm. "We will do whatever it takes to protect her. If that means I must face the Kariel rat authorities, I will." The transport traversed the atmosphere of Quarum, and the clouds began to clear, revealing a bright sky. In the distance, the silhouette of the Krentz rat outpost appeared, a functional metallic structure standing like a fortress amid a planet ravaged by war. Heron knew that what would happen there would determine his future and Yara's. When the transport landed on the outpost platform, the ramp opened, and a unit of Kelrat soldiers awaited them, weapons drawn. Heron raised his hands in a gesture of peace as Barkeldris quickly spoke with the commander of the group, explaining the situation. Yara leaned on Heron, and he felt her body trembling as they walked together toward the group. The commander, a cell rat with sharp features and a stern expression, scrutinized them before signaling for their weapons to be lowered. "This human has risked his life to save Yara," Barachis said, his voice carrying the seriousness of his testimony. "He is not a threat. We need immediate medical assistance." The commander looked at Heron with critical eyes, assessing every word and gesture. Finally, he nodded with a brusque gesture. "Take them." They relaxed as the Xelrat soldiers guided them into the outpost. However, he knew this was just the first step. The battle was far from over. Their struggle now was to convince the authorities that the truce was not just temporary, but the beginning of something more. As the medical team prepared to assist Yara, Heron stayed by her side, holding her hand. In his mind, he felt one last telepathic connection before she slipped into unconsciousness. "Thank you, Heron. I trust you more than I trust anyone in my own people." Heron squeezed her hand, his resolve strengthening. Whatever happened, he would protect Yara and the children. He had found something worth fighting for, and he would not let anything tear them apart. The echo of footsteps resonated in the metallic hallways of the Kariel rat outpost, as Heron followed closely behind the medical team transporting Yara on a stretcher. Commander Necron walked ahead, his movements firm and his demeanor impenetrable. Though they had allowed Heron and Yara to enter, the air was thick with distrust and tension. Heron knew that his presence there was precarious. One mistake, and everything he had achieved so far could crumble. Berkonis and the other soldiers stayed close, acting as a silent barrier between Heron and the rest of the Shell Rat personnel. To them, he remained a stranger, a human in a territory where he was unwelcome. But Barricus's presence was, at least for now, a shield that Heron needed. Yara, in a semi-conscious state, tried to open her eyes as they brought her to the medical room. Heron felt the weak telepathic connection, a whisper that barely reached his mind. "I'm here," he replied softly, squeezing her hand as the doctors prepared the equipment to stabilize her. Commander Necron glanced at him from the corner of his eye, his gaze calculating. "If you truly wish for her to survive, you must cooperate with us," he said, his voice cold but direct. "The situation is delicate, and your actions will define what happens next." Heron nodded. "I will do whatever is necessary, but understand that what I've done was to save lives. Yara and her children represent an opportunity for something beyond war." Necron studied him intently, his scrutinizing eyes locked onto Heron. "That remains to be seen. The higher authorities will decide their fate." As Heron watched the doctors work on Yara, he heard the whisper of monitors and devices attempting to stabilize her. The atmosphere was tense. The doctors knew they were dealing with a critically ill patient, but they also understood there was something more at stake. The Kelrat were warriors, but they also valued life, especially when that life could change the course of a conflict that had lasted too long. Hours passed, in a whirlwind of waiting and worry. Heron did not leave Yara's side, ignoring the wary glances from soldiers and officials who watched him with caution. Finally, one of the doctors approached with a neutral expression, but a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "We've managed to stabilize her, but her condition remains delicate." "The children?" The doctor hesitated for a moment, as if unsure how to express what he was about to say. "They are more advanced than we imagined. There is something in them, something we have not seen before." Heron felt a mix of relief and concern. "Will they survive?" The doctor nodded slowly. "With the proper care, yes. But constant monitoring will be necessary. Their telepathic abilities are different." Necron, who had been listening in silence, stepped closer. "It seems what you said is true, humans. Children are special. But make no mistake, that does not guarantee their safety here." His eyes met Heron's. "You must understand that trust is not easily earned, especially in wartime." "Listen." Heron looked at him firmly. "I understand, Commander, but these children could be the key to something greater. War has brought us nothing but destruction. If there is a chance to change that, we must seize it." Necron nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. "Then let's do this. I will convince my superiors that Yara and the children must be protected, but in exchange, you will have to stay here under our supervision. You will be responsible for them and for any situation that arises from their presence." Heron knew he had no other option. "I accept. I will stay and do what is necessary to protect them." Barfakis, who had been silent until that moment, stepped forward. "I will also give my word that this human is not a threat. If he has risked his life for Yara, he deserves at least the chance to prove he can be part of something greater." With that agreement, Heron's and Yara's fates were sealed. The following days were a whirlwind of medical tests and discussions with Carol Rat officials. Heron stayed by Yara's side throughout, and when she finally regained full consciousness, he explained everything that had happened. "We're in this together," he said, holding her hand as the monitors recorded her vital signs. "And now we have the chance to change more than just our own lives." Yara, still weak but with a spark of determination in her eyes, nodded. "If these children can be a bridge between our species, it's worth fighting for." "But you know it won't be easy." Heron nodded. "I know, but we have to try." Weeks turned into months, and the small outpost transformed into a place of hope. The children born under the protection of both sides became a symbol of what could happen if peace was achieved. Heron and Yara, now an inseparable team, worked with the Chrysel Rat leaders to secure a future where the differences between their peoples could be overcome. Bartcomus and the other soldiers, who had initially doubted Heron, became his closest allies. Together, they defended the bunker that had become a sanctuary for the children. The telepathic abilities of the little ones developed rapidly, and their powers proved to be a combination of the strengths of both species. Over time, news of the children and their significance reached the upper echelons of Rat and human government. Representatives from both factions came to see the children who, in many words, were the hope for a better future. In that small outpost, a truce that had initially been temporary turned into a pact to seek a definitive solution to the conflict. Heron and Yara, who had faced adversity together, became leaders of the change their peoples needed. As their children grew, they learned to use their powers to unite, not to divide, demonstrating that peace was possible, even amid war. In the end, as Heron watched Yara hold one of their children in her arms, he felt a peace he had not known for a long time. Together, they knew they had marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of their peoples, one in which war would not be the answer, but cooperation and unity. And as the suns of Quarum rose on the horizon, Heron and Yara looked at each other, knowing that in the end, they had achieved much more than mere survival. They had taken a step toward a future of peace and hope.